Hi, I'm Pranamya and you're watching Pages of Globe. So if you're new to my channel, essentially I just read short stories, sometimes poems, and I'll tell you a little bit about the author, their legacy, their biggest accomplishments, and then I'll give you an in-depth review of the story and an analysis. I'll tell you about the motifs, the symbols, the themes present. I'll give you a character analysis. I'll explain to you what the author intended the story to mean and how we can use it in today's time, and then obviously just my personal thoughts about the story. The story that I'll be reading to you today is called Dead Man's Path by Chinua Achebe. This is a very powerful short story about this young man and explores essentially just the tension between tradition and modernity, specifically progress. It is set in this small Nigerian village and it follows the story of this young school headmaster whose idealistic vision for modernization comes into conflict with the nearby village's idea. The story very much raises deeper questions about just respect, colonialism, and the costs of change. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the author. So Chinua Achebe was born in November 16th, 1930 in Nigeria, a town in the Igbo region, OGD. He actually grew up in the era of British colonial rule, and that experience truly influenced his writing, and you can see that in today's story, especially his focus on African identity, post-colonial struggles, and cultural conflict. He is best known for his groundbreaking novel Things Fall Apart, published in 1958, which is widely regarded as one of the most important works in African literature. It was one of the first novels to truly portray African society from an African perspective rather than the European colonial lens that most of literature had been producing before that time. He has published several other novels, including No Longer at Ease, Era of God, and Anthills of the Savannah, along with many essays, poems, and short stories like Dead Man's Path, which was first published in 1953. His work truly challenged things like the Western narrative and just our understanding, like global understanding of African culture and history. He taught in universities across Nigeria and the United States, including Brown University, where he was a professor until his death. He received numerous honors, including the Man Booker International Prize in 2007 and over 30 honorary doctorates from universities around the world. He passed away in 2013, but his legacy still lives on as a foundational figure in African literature and a voice of post-colonial resistance and cultural pride. This story is so interesting, and it's definitely very similar to other stories I've read before. I feel like it touches on sort of the same topics as a short story I just read recently called Flowers. If you are interested in checking that out, go ahead. It's Flowers by Alice Walker. But without further ado, let's get on with the video. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like me to read next. Dead Man's Path by Chinua Achebe. Michael Obi's hopes were fulfilled much earlier than he had expected. He was appointed headmaster of Ndume Central School in January 1949. It had always been an unprogressive school, so the mission authorities decided to select an energetic young man to run it. Obi accepted this responsibility with enthusiasm. He had many wonderful ideas, and this was an opportunity to put them into practice. He had sound secondary school education, which designed him as a pivotal teacher in the official records and set him apart from other headmasters in the mission field. He was outspoken in his condemnation of the narrow views of those older and often less educated ones. "We shall make a good job of it, shan't we?" he asked his young wife when they first heard the joyful news of his promotion. "We shall do our best. We shall have such beautiful gardens, and everything will be just modern and delightful," she replied. In their 2 years of married life, she had become completely infected by his passion for modern methods and his denigration of those old and super innuated people in the teaching field who would be better employed as traders in the Onitsha market. She began to see herself already as the admired wife of the young headmaster, the queen of the school. The wives of the other teachers would envy her position. She would set the fashion in everything. Then, it suddenly occurred to her that there might not be other wives. Wavering between hope and fear, she asked her husband, looking anxiously at him. "All of our colleagues are young and unmarried," he said with enthusiasm, which for once she did not share. "Which is a good thing," he continued. "Why?" "Why? They will give all their time and energy to the school." Nancy was downcast. For a few minutes she became skeptical about the new school, but only for a few minutes. Her little personal misfortune could not blind her to her husband's happy prospects. She looked at him as he sat folded up in a chair. He was stoop-shouldered and looked frail, but sometimes he surprised people with sudden outbursts of physical energy. In his present posture, however, all of his bodily strength seemed to have retired behind his deep-set eyes, giving them an extraordinary power of penetration. He was only 26, but he looked 30 or more. On the whole, he was not unhandsome. "A penny for your thoughts, Mike," said Nancy after a while, imitating the women's magazine she read. "I was thinking what a grand opportunity we've got, at last, to show these people how a school should be run." Nadube School was backward in every sense of the word. Mr. Obi put his whole life into the work, and his wife's hers too. He had two aims. A high standard of teaching was insisted upon, and the school compound was to be turned into a place of beauty. Nancy's dream gardens came to life with the comings of rain and blossomed. Beautiful hibiscus and alamanda hedges and brilliant red and yellow marked out the carefully tended school compound from the rank neighborhood bushes. One evening, as Obi was admiring his work, he was scandalized to see an old woman from the village hobble right across the compound through a marigold flower bed and the hedges. On going up there, he found faint signs of an almost disused path from the village across the school compound to the bush on the other side. "It amazes me," said Obi to one of his teachers, who had been 3 years in the school, "that you people allowed the villagers to make use of this footpath. It is simply incredible." He shook his head. "The path," said the teacher apologetically, "appears to be very important to them. Although it is hardly used, it connects the village shrine with their place of burial." "And what has that got to do with the school?" said the headmaster. "Well, I don't know," replied one of them with a shrug of his shoulders. "But I remember there was a big row some time ago when we attempted to close it." "That was some time ago, but it will not be used now," said Obi as he walked away. "What will the government education officer think of this when he comes to inspect the school next week? The villagers might, for all I know, decide to use the schoolroom for a pagan ritual during the inspection." Heavy stakes were planted closely across the path at the two places where it entered and left the school premises. These were also further strengthened by barbed wire. 3 days later, the village priest of Annie called on the headmaster. He was an old man and walked with a slight stoop. He carried a stout walking stick, which he usually tapped on the floor by way of emphasis each time he made a new point in his argument. "I have heard," he said, after the usual exchange of cordialities, "that our ancestral footpath has been recently closed." "Yes," replied Mr. Obi. "We cannot allow people to make a highway of our school compound." "Look here, my son," said the priest, bringing down his walking stick. "This path was here before you were born and before your father was born. The whole life of this village depends on it. Our dead relatives depart by it, and our ancestors visit us by it. But most important, it is the path of children coming in to be born." Mr. Obi listened with a satisfied smile on his face. "The whole purpose of our school," he said finally, "is to eradicate just such beliefs as that. Dead men do not require footpaths. The whole idea is just fantastic. Our duty is to teach your children to laugh at such ideas." "What you say may be true," replied the priest, "but we follow the practices of our fathers. If you reopen the path, we shall have nothing to quarrel about. What I always say is, let the hawk perch and let the eagle perch. He rose to go. I am sorry, said the young headmaster, but our school compound cannot be a thoroughfare. It is against our regulations. I would suggest you're constructing another path, skirting our premises. We could even get our boys to help in building it. I don't suppose the ancestors will find the little detour too burdensome? I have no more words to say, said the old priest already outside. 2 days later, a young woman in the village died in childbirth. A diviner was immediately consulted, and he prescribed heavy sacrifices to propitiate ancestors insulted by the fence. Obi woke up the next morning among the ruins of his work. The beautiful hedges were torn up, not just near the path, but right round the school. The flowers trampled to death, and one of the school buildings pulled down. That day, the white supervisor came to inspect the school and wrote a nasty report on the state of the premises, but more seriously about the tribal war situation developing between the school and the village, arising in part from the misguided zeal of the new headmaster. The end. So that was Dead Man's Path by Chinua Achebe. Before I continue with an analysis, I'm just going to give you a quick summary or overview. So essentially, this story centers around this man named Michael Obi, who is this young, modern, very ambitious headmaster. And he is essentially hired to work at this pretty rural Nigerian school. And he's very, very eager to reform it. He is bringing in these European style decisions, European style order, discipline, and aesthetics. And he and his wife are very excited. Soon after they come to the school and they really renovate a lot of things there, he finds that there's this footpath that runs through the school's compound, and it's essentially this dead man's path, and it's used by all the locals that live in the village for spiritual and cultural reasons, because they believe that they need to use that path to connect the village shrine and the burial grounds to the village. So Michael, he's very modern. He sees this as just some type of primitive superstition, and so he blocks the path with a fence and barbed wire, and he essentially just refuses to listen to the village priest, and he is very, very angry. Or not angry, but he's just very adamant that he will not allow this footpath to be to be created, because it is making the school look bad in his mind. Now, unfortunately, in the village, a woman dies in childbirth, and her spirit is believed to be unable to pass through the now blocked path. So the villagers kind of retaliate, and they destroy the fence, they trample the gardens, they tear up the school grounds, and then Michael, he ends up being blamed by the education officer who visits for an inspection, not just for the destruction, but also just because he failed to maintain a good relationship with the village. So what are some core themes we see here? First of all, there's just this classic struggle of tradition versus modernity. So at the heart of the story, right, what do we see? We see there's this clash that's happening between the traditional African beliefs and this imposed Western modernity. So Michael Obi, he represents this westernized, educated African. He's not a white man, his last name is Obi, so we can assume that he is an African, and he truly believes that progress means going with the Western norms and eradicating traditional culture. However, the villagers represent indigenous values and customs, and they have a more spiritual connection, a more spiritual worldview, especially have respect for their ancestors and the spiritual realm. So what the author is trying to do here is he's not necessarily, demonizing modernity. I mean, when we start off, I really think the author, Achebe, he does something really brilliant with this, which I don't think he, completely paints Michael as this villain, right? I mean, yes, he's very arrogant, but he's not necessarily a bad person. He truly just wants the best for the school. And what the author is doing here is he's not saying, okay, being modern is bad. He's just critiquing the arrogance that sometimes comes along with forcing modern values on people without having any respect or understanding for them. So what Michael is doing is, he truly does believe he's building a better future, but he is while he's doing that, he's destroying part of the community's past and their present now. So what is some symbolism we see? There is obvious symbolism in just the footpath, right? It's not just this trail, it's this symbol for the village as like cultural continuity. It connects the past with all of their dead ancestors to the living, and we can also assume that it connects, the future, all of the unborn children. By putting the fence up, by putting barbed wire up, he's essentially cutting off the village's spiritual lifeline, and that's why they react so strongly. It's not just like they're not saying, they're not doing it to be petty. They're literally doing it because it is such an important part of their life for them. For him, he's just fixing essentially landscaping, but to the villagers, he is literally damning souls, right? Now the souls of dead people can't cross through and they can't get to the place where they need to get. So obviously there is some type of issue there. Another thing which we have talked about a lot, I would say, especially in the 21st century, is this colonial mindset that people seem to have even without actual colonizers. So the actual white colonial officers, they only appear briefly, right? They appear at the very end and at the very beginning for maybe one or two sentences. However, their beliefs and their ideology is throughout the story. Michael Obi, who is literally an African, he seems to have his own internalized colonial values, right? And I'm not saying he has these values because he wants to reform the school. It's because, first of all, he sees the local culture as backwards. He is trying to literally civilize, quote unquote, civilize the community. And then he's also using a lot of European standards as the model for a perfect school, tidy lawns, barred, blocking paths so people can't walk through it, rigid planning. So what the author is trying to do here is he's literally, there's this term for it called colonial mimicry, and showing that even educated, incredibly smart Africans can become enforcers, or not just Africans, but people of color in general can become enforcers of cultural erasure. There is a lot of irony shown in this story. Michael's downfall is literally, he aimed to modernize the school, but he ended up ruining it even more because of his acts against the villagers. And he tried to impress the colonial system, he wanted to make these white colonial officers be wow, what a nice African school. But they actually blame him at the end. They're why did you incite such issues? And to him, he's always talking about rationality will fix everything, logic will fix everything. But his arrogance and his refusal to compromise ends up causing so much chaos. I believe that the author's point here is essentially just when you try and use logic and reason, but you don't also use empathy or try to understand the other culture, you're going to get to a dead end. You're not going to be able to move forward. And that's truly so important. I want to give a quick character analysis. So first of all, we have Michael Obi. He represents this generation of Africans who embraced European education and dismissed their indigenous knowledge. So his fatal flaw is hubris, essentially. He can't imagine that he might be wrong or that the traditional culture has any type of value. So, he is this man who truly believes he's building a future, and he's not wrong in that. He is very genuine in that. but he's so disconnected from the people that he is supposed to be serving. And I think this is so relatable, not just to Africans. I can see this happening in India. I've seen discourse happening about this happening in China. I feel like this is across the world truly with any type of people of color. And I would say his character foil perhaps is the village priest, Ani. He's very wise, he's calm, he's so respectful even when he's confronting this young man who is disrespecting him, when he's confronting Obi. And he tries to essentially just explain that, this path is very vital to our beliefs. So his role is he is the voice of indigenous reason. And he heavily contrasts Obi's Western dogmatism. So I want to explain the ending really quick, right? First of all, we see that the colonial officer's report, it reads, the exact quote is, "A nasty situation arose from the misguided zeal of a new headmaster." So Michael's zeal was supposed to be some type of virtue, right? I have to say, in the beginning of the story, I was like, okay, yes, he seemed like a little bit of an a-hole, but he had the zeal that he has is going to bring him forward, I'm sure. It's going to push him forward because he's so passionate. But that has a bad side to it as well, because his refusal to compromise, to listen, to try and understand the village makes him the architect and also victim of his own collapse. Also, we see that the colonial system doesn't seem to really care about culture or reform, only what are the results happening. So Michael, their loyal servant, essentially just gets thrown under the bus. I want to talk a little bit about the title and then I'll wrap it up. So the title is Dead Man's Path. And at first, it's pretty literal, right? There is literally a path that is used by the spirits of the dead. But it's also very metaphorical, I would say, because it represents how the ancestor, dead men, and I feel like though that can connect with tradition, they still shape the living world, right? The path itself is very much alive. People walk through it often, and it is necessary for the village. In the villagers' minds, it's necessary for it to continue existing so that the village can continue existing and doing well. So by blocking it, you're essentially rejecting not just history, culture, tradition, but also, by blocking it, you're making these villagers think that they're not going to be as successful anymore. And that's obviously going to end in disaster. At the end of the day, the story, I would say, is a very good critique of cultural arrogance and the failure to really understand what development really means. And I want to bring this point up again because, again, the author is not completely saying being modern is bad. He's just saying you can't take that arrogance with you anytime you step into a more traditional place. Real change doesn't come from just bulldozing the past and completely getting rid of any traditions, any faith, any values, any indigenous values. It comes from respecting it, integrating it, and then moving forward, and continuously bringing in new ideas, new systems. That is it for today. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like me to read next.